Hey y'all, Van Luva here, watching and recapping the Derek Chauvin trial so you don't have to. Today we move on to day 13. Obviously no scrub of the day, I'm still being sarcastic. Day 13 took place on Wednesday, April 14th, 2021. Some big things happened right out of the gate today. So today, for motions, the big one was Eric Nelson came right out the gate and called for a motion for the acquittal of Derek Chauvin. What he said was the court needs to view the evidence presented in the light, in the most favorable light to the state. The defense admits that the state has failed to present sufficient evidence in the most favorable light to the state to establish two of the principal issues of argument in this case, which are the use of force and the cause of death of Mr. Floyd. The state has provided 6 different opinions on whether use of force experts, all of whom seem to contradict themselves and each other. So basically, he was saying, hey, you guys had all these experts up and none of them agreed. And he thinks that's enough to, just acquit Officer Chauvin. He stated that Lindsay Thomas, who was a medical examiner, said the cause of death was asphyxia, and Dr. Baker, who was the medical examiner who actually did the autopsy, suggested something different. He suggested that his heart just couldn't take it. So he said in that situation, the state introduced doubt. Obviously, the state opposed of this motion. After talking it over, Judge Cahill denied the motion, which I think we all expected. Then the next order of business that they had today was Maurice Hall and his lawyer were there. His lawyer spoke. She said she had reviewed the questions that he was going to be asked if he testified, and he cannot answer any of them. Some of the questions were they wanted to know how Floyd looked in the SUV. Then they just discussed, more questions that he was going to be asked. One example of a question they were going to ask was, how he appeared in the SUV. And she said basically what that would have done then was placed Mr. Hall in the car. And since there were drugs found in the car, that could implicate him in that. Mr. Hall came to the podium and he said, are you willing to answer these questions? And he said no, because he has open charges. Judge Cahill still wanted both sides to submit the questions that they were going to ask him to offer proof, but that he will honor the Fifth Amendment privilege. So Maurice Hall got out of testifying, and they did what's called, they quashed the subpoenas. Okay, defense witness number 7 today was David Fowler. He's a retired forensic pathologist. He'd been doing it since 1986, 30 plus years. He had worked in the office of the chief state medical examiner in Maryland. He also did consultation cases on occasion. He talked about his education background. He got his degrees from South Africa. He did have an accent. I believe that's where he was from. He discussed the difference between South African and American education. He has been a forensic pathologist in the United States since 1995. He described all of his roles. His job is to find the cause of death. He also taught at the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins Hospital, the FBI Academy, and multiple universities internationally. He is also trained forensic pathologist and supervised residency programs. He has testified in state and federal cases. hundreds of times, he said. Cheers. He has published articles. He does do peer reviews on a forensics panel, and he charges $350 an hour for his time. He was approached for this case by Mr. Nelson. Then they did end up covering this case on the forensics panel that he is a part of. There were 13 peer reviewers. They talked about his approach when reviewing a case. And I wrote, they talked ad nauseum about the process. A review can take 2 to 3 months to finish, just depending on the complexity of it. He talked about how Maryland has specialized pathologists like cardiac pathologists, pulmonary pathologists. He belongs to an association called NAME, which is the National Association of Medical Examiners. And they also are part of the forensic panel that he is on. And they require them to have 90% of their cases done in 90 days. He stated if they take longer than 90 days, then it's usually because they're a very complex case. Explained what the death certificate was, reviewed past medical records, records from the hospital. He reviewed ambulance records, police records, toxicology information, multiple videos from multiple sources, the autopsy information, including photographs. Have you formed an opinion in this case? Yes. He discussed what the 2 parts of the death certificate are. The first part is what the physician believes is the cause of death. And the second part are the contributing conditions, but they don't have to necessarily be directly related to number 1. Exhibit 193 was the death certificate of Mr. Floyd. He asked if he had prepared a PowerPoint presentation to walk through his opinions in this case, and he had. Exhibit 1098 was that PowerPoint. In summary, he stated his opinion, it was a sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease during his subdual and neck restraint. He also talked about contributing conditions such as fentanyl and meth intoxication, exposure to vehicle exhaust and carbon monoxide poisoning, and the paraganglioma. They also discussed again the 5 manners of death that medical examiners use. Do you remember what they are? They are accidental, natural, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. Now you'll be able to answer that. They talked about on the autopsy, it was found that he had an enlarged heart. He expected to be a little larger because of his size and age. They asked, how does a larger heart size affect things? He said when it's enlarged, its consumption increases, things like oxygen, blood, and nutrition. So basically what that means is he would need more oxygen, more blood, and more nutrition to the heart based on its larger size. He thought the leading cause of an enlarged heart was his essential hypertension. The size of his heart was evidence that he had hypertension. He talked about some of the arteries in the heart. There are some drugs that can cause more rapid atherosclerosis, and meth can be one of them. They talked about how his right coronary artery had 90% narrowing. They discussed the fight or flight response. They discussed the blood pressure that they had found on him in 2019 of 216/160 and how that affected his stress response. And then they took a mid-morning break because of course they did. When they came back, it was time for cross-examination by the state. At this point, cross-examination was done by Jerry Blackwell, and what I wrote in the little side column here was, he came in like a wrecking ball, because he did. Okay. He started right out the gate, you guys. He was annoyed, and he was going to let everybody know. Do you believe as an expert witness you should be objective and impartial? Yes. and thorough, doing your homework before you testify? Yes. I asked that because you said Mr. Chauvin's weight was 140 pounds. Yes. And that was the information that I was provided, he said. Who provided this to you, counsel? Were you not told that he was wearing equipment? I did not consider that in the process. I agree with you. You didn't factor in the weight of the equipment that was on Mr. Floyd? He said this is true. You shouldn't be biased. You shouldn't cherry pick the facts, right? No. You shouldn't try to confuse the jury, correct? Correct. You spent quite a bit of time talking about carbon monoxide, yes. You have not seen any data or test results showing that Mr. Floyd had any injury from carbon monoxide. This is true, he said. Have you ever laid eyes on that squad car? I have not. You don't know if it had a single or a double exhaust? He said, I was told it had a double exhaust. And that, were you told that it was a hybrid? And he said, yes. He asked, do you agree that do you agree that there was no carbon monoxide poisoning on Dr. Baker's review? Yes. How do you even know the car was even on? He said, I asked and I noticed water dripping from a tailpipe. So he said, you didn't see any data from anyone saying the car was on or off? He said, correct. He referred to 2 carbon monoxide studies. These studies involved 3 people. And Mr. Blackwell asked, well, how long were these people exposed to carbon monoxide? He said, it was unknown. He described a white substance that was in Mr. Floyd's mouth. Exhibit 29 was cup foods footage. He said, are you aware that in the footage that George was chewing? And he said, no. So they showed exhibits 812 and 813. They were still photos from that video of him with a white substance in his mouth. If you said the white substance was seen as if you said that the white substance seen was a pill, that would be jumping to conclusions, correct? And he said, I said there was a white substance in his mouth. So you didn't imply it was a pill? No. You had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about a scientist, Dr. Ray, and that statement you made was that he had been critical of prone positioning and its relation to asphyxia, but that he later retracted that opinion. And he said, yes. That statement was never retracted by Dr. Ray. Isn't that the real truth? And he said he withdrew it and said it was more for people who were obese. That's what I remember. Exhibit 818 was an affidavit from Dr. Ray, signed and dated. And they read that affidavit, and then he said, yes. Let's see if he retracted it. This was one of the studies you were referring to today. He read it, and I wrote in here, Jerry Blackwell was feisty. Do you see where that is not the case here? And he said, yes. Does seeing this change your opinion of Dr. Ray and whether he retracted his statement? He said, it appears